Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, the impact of President Trump's stunning victory in the 2024 presidential election 1 week ago. What were the biggest issues that swayed more voters his way? How did he make inroads with Black and Latino voters? Is a mass deportation of undocumented immigrants among the first things President Trump might implement in his first 100 days in office? And what other priorities would you like to see him tackle in the early days of his new administration? Tonight we have two special guests in-house, familiar faces as you'll see them, to offer their opinions. But first, we would like to hear from you to help drive the discussion here on the show. You can do that on social media, on Facebook. You can email us, you can comment on YouTube, and you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows, you can log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Our guests tonight, as I said, familiar faces. They've been on the show before. Daniel Soza, Refugee Capacity Team Lead with Samaritas Refugee Services, and Gary Loster, the former Saginaw Mayor and CEO of the Loster Group Consulting. Nice to have you back, gentlemen.
Thank you.
So let's start here. The economy, immigration, reproductive rights, the war in Gaza, they were among the factors, the bigger factors in the election last week. Here we are a week later trying to digest what the heck happened here. Which issues ultimately do you think swayed in President Trump's favor, Gary?
Well, I think as I listened to some people, Mike, people wanted a change. Now, trying to identify what change really means, I'm not sure. But of course, the immigrations was an issue that was really never clearly defined, crime, and kitchen table issues. Inflation, although we've had probably the best time that we've seen in a number of years, gas prices and things like that. So they wanted change, and again, I'm trying to identify what change really meant, given the fact that unemployment was at an all-time low. Gasoline prices are coming down. I think today it was $2.87. And employment opportunity is booming. The stock market went up, so I'm not exactly sure, but you hear people talk about inevitably we want change.
Yeah, and maybe the voters thought it was too little too late when it came to the economy turning around a little bit post-COVID.
Right.
It just came too late. Is that what your sort of assessment is, that the economy certainly was, I think, number one? I just think that was it, and they just were ready for some change.
Yeah, it seems like the economy was the number one thing in people's mind when they went to the polls, and without a concrete plan to, how are we going to bring down the cost of groceries? I think that's what a lot of people saw and didn't vote for the Democrats in this case. Sure, all those economic markers showed where the economy was improving, but when people went to the grocery store, they're still paying double what they used to pay for eggs and bacon and those sort of things. Because if they're looking at their 401ks and 403bs, like me, they're pretty happy about what they're seeing. So, without a lot of more information on what exactly, these exit polls and the data that's going to come, it seems like that was the issue.
Yeah, and then let's talk a little bit about sort of the Harris campaign. I mean, she was put behind the 8 ball when they pushed Biden out of there. Do you feel that whatever her message just didn't resonate, she didn't have enough time, she wasn't clear about what she really wanted to do, or was it simply no matter what Democratic candidate you put out there, once Biden was pushed out, they were going to run out of this Trump train regardless?
Well, I think too, Mike, it was a lot of animosity to the way it was done to Joe Biden. Number two, Biden had also indicated early on that he was going to do a year and then he would leave. But the time frame, I think, for Harris was something like 107 days or something like that. It's impossible to run a full campaign at that level with 107 days. And so I think those variables, along with other things, were certainly concerning in the fact that not being able to connect because I think now the Democratic Party is being seen as elitist, that they're not in touch with the ordinary man. They're not in touch with the people on the ground. They're not in touch with the people who are doing the grocery shopping, like Dan said. They're buying the eggs, they're buying the meat and the bread, and you don't understand the pain I'm going through at the pump and everything else. I'm trying to get back to work. I got daycare. So I think there were a number of things, again, that impacted that race in terms of her trying to run for president.
She didn't have the time to develop a real platform. You know, in today's political times, a candidate's going to come up with a platform based on test marketing, right? They're gonna test this idea out, see how they play amongst potential voters, and form something based on that. She did not have the time to do that. And I think the real story, when you look at the numbers, is 20 million people didn't vote this time around that voted in the prior election. Now, were they all Democrats? Maybe. And you know, I think one of the numbers that we're starting to see are the impact of what's going on in the West Bank. You know, did a lot of Democratic voters that didn't come out this time not come out because they weren't happy with either party's stance? I think that once we get to that data point where why didn't 20 million people come out and vote this time?
Right.
I think that's when we're really going to see the answers to some of these questions.
Oh, and certainly because of Dearborn in Michigan, I mean,
Yeah,
once they
absolutely.
did the analytics on that, clearly there was a big shift there. And speaking of shifts, I mean, Trump did increase his voters in terms of the Latino community and the Black community. Still doesn't have a majority, of course, but he certainly made inroads. So I have to ask both of you, because you sort of represent both of those communities, what were you hearing in your circle of influence in terms of voters in your communities, Gary?
I'd heard again, Mike, that they wanted change, not all of them, but some of them wanted change just to see which direction it was going. And the other big thing, at least in the community, was the fact that they perceived that Trump gave them the stimulus check, when actually that was voted on during the Obama administration. And some of them were thinking that, okay, if he did it the last time, he'll do it again. But he had nothing to do with that stimulus check. So that was tied again to a number of the young people, young Black men, who heard the fact that, okay, Trump gets in again, I'm going to get another stimulus check. But that wasn't the case, in fact, when he didn't in the first place authorize and/or he put his signature on the check. But Trump originally voted against that in terms of providing that stimulus check. But I heard change, looking at a different methodology of how we do things, and we just think it's time to change. The Democratic Party, to some degree, now there's perception that they weren't doing anything for them anymore, and they weren't listening. You know, it's very difficult to listen when you're talking.
Right.
So I think that was a big factor, is they were not being heard as to what their cares and concerns were.
So what about the Latino voters?
So, you know, we're often associated with the issue of immigration, right?
Which we're going to get into, so
Sure, yeah,
hang
yeah.
in for that. Yeah.
But when you poll us nationwide, it in most cases does not crack the top five. You know, the top five issues are the same as they are with any other group: the economy, jobs, education, those sorts of things. You know, so and why is that? It's because the Latino population in America, it's not all immigrant. It's really a fraction. The immigrant community is really a fraction of the Latino population. So, you know, I'll look at my family. We've been in Michigan for going on 100 years, and in this country, well over 100 years. So when I think of my identity, sure, I'm Mexican American, I'm a Michigander, but I think what you have in the Latino population is a lot of people who have kind of disconnected from the immigrant story. And, you know, like it or not, I think that's led to somewhat of a lack of empathy, especially amongst young Latinos. And that was the shift that you saw: young Latino males who are looking at that immigration story, maybe in their own family, as ancient history. You know, they don't see that connection between themselves and the immigrant community of today.
Well, let's segue into that. We was putting that off a little bit, but I think there's a lot of ground to cover on immigration and the border crisis. It's certainly a big factor in the election. That's something that Trump and his folks were pounding day after day after day, and the country was sort of they were sort of listening. There were a lot of headlines too, and he's already tabbed ICE Director Tom Homan as the border czar. He's been on every show, every media the last couple days. Clearly in these first 100 days, the Trump administration wants to make that a point of emphasis. Estimated roughly between 10 and 12 million undocumented immigrants in the U.S. and upwards of 175,000 in Michigan. 65,000 of those working in manufacturing, construction, agriculture. So, Daniel, how do you see this playing out? This is sort of in your wheelhouse.
Sure.
So what part of the story are we missing? I mean, in the media and during the election, it was kind of like, yeah, just they're undocumented, they're illegal.
Yeah, yeah.
Get them out of here. They're not here legally. So let's ship them out by the boatloads. But so what story aren't they hearing? And I think you want to clear the air in some of this. So.
Yeah, you know, what I'm seeing is that there's no real discussions being had, in fact. And I saw that coming from both sides. I didn't see the Democrats really explaining the way the immigration system works. You know, I work in refugee resettlement. So for instance, you know, when we talk about the border bill that didn't pass this last time around, you know, the big thing that had in it was funding for more judges and more immigration officials to process the people coming to the border as refugees. That's why you have so many undocumented along the border and throughout the country, because they're undocumented. They're not here illegally. They followed the rules. They came to a port of entry, presented themselves as a refugee, and they're waiting for their case to be heard. But when you've got one judge for every 10,000 cases, what's going to happen? You're going to have a logjam. So, you know, nobody really explained that, the whole situation throughout the election. You know, for instance, we saw the story in Ohio about Haitians. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? If you're a Haitian, if you're a Cuban, if you're a Nicaraguan, and if you're a Venezuelan, you are here legally. You have what's called temporary protected status. Biden extended that to all the people coming from those countries because of the political conflict going on in those countries. You know, and you saw what got the headlines, the eating cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio. I think I maybe saw it on national media covered once, you know, that they have temporary protected status. They're here legally. So you can be undocumented and still have legal presence. Those two terms, undocumented and illegal, are not equal.
So obviously it's not one size fits all, and I think it's kind of whitewashed, and they're undocumented, they're illegal, they have to get out of here. You've got some information, I think, to show the viewers about the amount of, I guess, immigrants that are working in this country, the value they bring to this country economically, and sort of the downside if you just sort of one size fits all, don't vet them properly, shoo them to the border, and what we're going to be missing here. So here's something there.
So when we talk about the immigrant population, we rarely put a number on it. You know, there's numbers thrown out. You know, but so this comes from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? So of the foreign-born workers, you're looking at 29.1 million people, and you know what that percentage that is, you know, around 18%. So when you're talking about mass deportations, let's think logistically. How do you deport 29.1 million people? And it's more than that. There's more people here that are here that could be deported, but that 29.1 million are people who are actually in jobs working in the U.S. labor force. What is going to happen to those companies, you know, to those employers when they lose all those workers? Will they lose all those workers? Is it logistically possible to do something like that?
So Gary, you've been around the block. You're a businessman, very savvy businessman. When you look at the terms of what we're talking about here, the value that this immigrant population brings, they're not all thugs, they're not all criminals. They're actually providing some substantial economic muscle between what we're doing here, right? And what are we going to see if we do this wrong?
Well, I think you're going to see, well, in fact, I know you will see confusion. And again, as Dan and I talked about earlier, one of the things in terms of knowing what the community really is, when we talk about Latin and Latinos, that there's a mixed group within that. It's not just Mexicans alone. But when we think about, as Dan has indicated, let's say we round everybody up. There are 850,000 police officers, including state police, in the United States today, or thereabouts. To round up the alleged number that the Trump administration is indicating, you would have to arrest 13 people per day. Now, logistically, it becomes a nightmare because where are you going to retain them, detain them, feed them, all of that in terms of separation and everything else. So it becomes logistically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that people probably were not thinking about is how it hits your kitchen table, because you're going to see things that have disappeared from your table because of the foreign-born workers and workers who are here now, which are working in agricultural and various other entities, and who are doing a great job. So all of a sudden, you're going to go into these places, and from what I understand and listening to the border czar, we're going to snatch them out, and we're going to relocate them, and how's that going to be done? So there is no plan to be able to do that, no plan to implement and or execute really as to how you're going to handle that, Mike, which is really a huge issue that's not being discussed.
Yeah, because prior to the election, we talked about the cost that we were paying as taxpayers to lodge these folks all over the country, fly them here, feed them, house them, give them gift cards. Okay, and that's legit. A lot of that's legit. It was costing us money, but now the other side of that, what you're saying is this is not going to be an overnight thing. We got to put them, we got to house them. We're going to have to feed them.
Where are you going to do it?
In terms of the gift cards, that was another one of those stories. It's like they're not getting thousands of dollars in gift cards. Many of the resources that they were given came from CBOs, community-based organizations, nonprofits that saw the humanitarian need. The federal tax dollars weren't just being handed out to these folks.
Sure.
That's just kind of something that that was invented, I guess, by the media, by people who are staunchly against immigration.
Right. So take us down
Yeah.
to the next page here that we've got to show sort of the foreign-born workforce, the U.S. Census, I guess.
Right. So, when we talk about the economic impact, and this is something that has long been said by people who are pro-immigration, is that there's a incredible contribution made to the tax dollars. So you see some of the numbers on here. In 1 year, $382.9 billion in federal taxes, $196.3 billion in state and local taxes. Now you might be wondering, well, how does an undocumented person pay taxes? So many of these people, like I mentioned earlier, undocumented does not mean illegal. An undocumented person may have an individual tax number that they pay taxes through. Their employer is going to pay taxes as a business. The owner of the company is going to pay taxes. There's taxes being paid. And the biggest number that you're going to see an impact of, I think immediately when people start being deported, assuming that happens, is on state taxes. Anybody who goes into a store, unless your state doesn't have state taxes, in Michigan it's been 6% as long as I can remember, you pay taxes on the goods that you buy. They don't ask you for ID, they don't ask you, if you're undocumented, you pay the tax because you pay tax on everything other than groceries, right? So those are dollars that we know are being spent on a minute-by-minute basis. So I think that's the biggest impact you're going to see when all these states, especially those red states in the South that have more an undocumented population, when they start losing those tax dollars that pay for those state programs, I think that's the big impact you're going to see immediately.
Okay. Got one more to show us?
Yep, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Sure. So when we talk about growth, we want the economy to grow. We want, to be prosperous in this country. We want as a whole, right? So the Congressional Budget Office came up with these numbers. In the economy over the next 10 years, immigrants will add $7 trillion to the economy and that was projected based on a 5.2 million immigrant worker increase over the next 10 years. But now you may not have that increase at all because you're going in the other direction, actually deporting people. So now do you not only not add that 7 trillion in all likelihood, but you're going to go backwards in terms of gross domestic product.
Right.
Which is something that any economist will tell you. I mean, when you look at growth in a country, when you look at prosperity, that's one of the number one indicators of prosperity.
Sure. Gary, I have to ask you, how many years ago were you the Saginaw mayor that you put together and launched this the sister city down in Mexico, roughly? 20 years?
20 years ago.
So take us back to that, and as Daniel's running through those numbers, how important this population is to our economy. Was that the kind of discussions you had down there, other side of the border, and you weren't, the situation is different today than it was 20 years ago. But
Absolutely.
Can you give us some perspective on this?
The economy, of course, back at that time with the Mexican government was thriving. And in fact, in Jalisco, Guadalajara, where we were in Zapopan particularly, I remember talking with the government, and we were talking about U.S. trade in Mexico. And they were buying all Ford products for their police department, their garbage trucks, and everything else. And just a matter of being able to sit down with them and say, well, listen, as we forge these relationships, I'm from a General Motors community, and I would certainly love to see you buy our product. Of course, things were flourishing then. We had good relations, and things were moving forward. So we were in a position where you could sit down and talk with people. It had a reason. There was something that was shared between both. We were able to accommodate them with reduced cost, and thereby having that fluid conversation between the two at the time. And talking about exchange opportunities, exchanges with the colleges, and then looking at equipment where, however, we may not use, maybe a fire truck or an ambulance, being able to make that switch and being able to change with professors and things of that nature. Much different time than what we're seeing now. And a willingness to be able to explore that opportunity, Mike, between the two countries.
Right.
I would say things were good back then.
So, you know, Dan, you're in kind of refugee settlement, but where is Mexico in this conversation?
So
Yeah.
you still see people come as refugees from Mexico. Not very much because it's, you know, the political situation there isn't like what's going on in Haiti, Venezuela, Nicaragua, or Cuba, right? So you do still see people coming. Many of them are coming on visas that allow them to be here based on things like human trafficking, abuse of some sort. The Office of Refugee Resettlement will give those people a visa and provide safe haven here in the United States.
Yeah.
But in general, in terms speaking, more Mexicans who are here, who are undocumented, are actually leaving the United States than are coming in. Most of the influx that you see of refugees come from Central America and South America.
Okay, that's an important point to bring out. And along this note, a lot of folks are concerned that the mass deportation may not be done humanely enough, in that we might separate families. Tom Homan, the guy that's going to become the new border czar, said, no, we're just going to send the families back together. Now that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense either, right?
It does not, because as you send those families back, you may be sending some U.S. citizens back at the same time who are, and this was pointed out to him. He said, what difference does it make? They don't want to leave their families, so we'll send them all back at the same time, which is inhumane, insensitive, no empathy at all. And I challenge where this guy, as I looked at him today, he said, I don't give two hoots about what they think about me. I'm going to get it done. Well, stranger things have happened before. Because you think that way does not necessarily endear you to, even for the folks who voted for Trump.
Right.
Because I submit that a number of people were not buying into what he's saying.
One other point on this, I guess, Daniel, and the work you do with Samaritas and refugee settlement, as you think about what the next step's going to be, how is that going to affect the work that you do and the families you're trying to, I guess, bring over?
So at Samaritas, we have two departments that work in refugee resettlement. We have refugee resettlement of individuals and families, and that's called our New Americans Department. And I'll tell you, during the first Trump administration, a lot of that work came to a screeching halt. And they moved into a mode where they had to support the people that they had here, and really couldn't resettle folks. Now, where I work in is specifically with what we call unaccompanied youth. That's protected by law. What we saw was that there wasn't a stop to what we were doing, because we're protected by the laws of the United States of America, but you saw a lot of community partners rally around these young people, because from an administrative standpoint, what we did see in the Trump administration was if you cut funding to what some of these departments do with these young people, like process green card applications, for instance. Well, if there's nobody there to do it now,
Right.
you could very well likely have submitted all your paperwork on time and not get it back on time because of the cuts to funding. So I'd imagine that in this coming administration, you're going to see at the very least that happen again. But with talk of things like, hey, let's get rid of the Department of Education, you could see this administration come in and say, well, hey, let's get rid of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's just one of those hypotheticals that we're just not sure what's going to happen.
Got about 2 minutes left. Gary, we're going to segue off of immigration and just kind of have a overall comment, I guess, as we go into this second administration of Donald Trump. Trying to be hopeful, talking about unification. What do you think?
I think that, and I always say this on your program, Mike, that America remains the greatest nation in the world, in spite of everything that we have. But I've never seen a race of this magnitude. The disrespect, the loss of integrity, morality, and ethics that have occurred, because we can run against people, but there's a way to do it in a civil way.
Right.
And what our young people were looking at as to how we conducted our business, be what it may, friend, foe, or whatever, electing our leaders in the highest land, in the highest office, rather, in the world, and this is how we conduct business. I'm concerned going forward, Mike. I think that the impact on this nation, at least for the foreseeable 2 years, as we know, these elections are cyclical. And again, next 2 years, it may be the Democrats, as we know, and people are changing consistently.
Right.
But the real concern is, what do we do now?
Right.
How is this going to impact this great nation?
Right.
How are the world leaders, of which are calling now to speak with him, how we will be perceived in the world in terms of being the greatest nation in the world? How will leaders see
We can
us
do
now?
better. I'll leave it at that. I know you agree with that statement. Dan.
Well said, well said.
Thanks, guys. Let's having you on. And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next Tuesday night for the follow-up. Local nonprofits are teaming up to provide more affordable housing in the area and building beds for kids who've been sleeping on floors and couches. You need your help, and you can learn more about it next week right here on the follow-up. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.